everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where the H is optional, and we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm with Tehrani Law LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. I've been practicing for 20 years in both criminal and civil law, and I have a lot of experience, especially in the courtroom. I am joined today by Dr. John Vile, who is the Dean of the Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University, and we are here to wish you a happy 4th of July in 2025. And what we're going to do on this particular podcast is discuss the 4th. Dr. Vile is so much of an expert of the founding of our country, the founding fathers, the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution, the amending process, and the Declaration of Independence, which is what he's holding up. So what we're going to do is Dr. Vile is going to tell us a lot of things that are extremely interesting about today, so that we can learn a little bit more about Independence Day, a couple more facts that you didn't know that we can appreciate with the founding of our country. He did write the book, The Declaration of Independence. And Dr. Vile, tell us what else is in the title, so that if we're looking it up, we know how to find it.
Right. It's America's first founding document in U.S. history and culture. And the one that I held up is the original hardback, but it's subsequently been published in paperback by Bloomsbury, which is a British publisher. And it's a fairly reasonable price for a fairly substantial book, a little over 400 and some pages.
Okay. And what is, in addition to the Declaration of Independence, what is the rest of the title, so we know?
Right. America's first founding document
in
U.S. history and culture.
All right. So that's actually part of the title.
It's a subtitle, yes.
Woo. All right. Excellent. So we're going to drink to that. This is the Legal Weekly Wine. Now, again, I've been a little bit away from the wine, but we're trying to do similar things. So I've got my fizzy drink of Izzy. So sparkling apple is my favorite. It really does taste like the sparkling ciders that you use, especially on New Year's for that celebration. So that's what I'm drinking today. And we're going to get back into the wine pretty soon. And Dr. Vile, it looks like you are toasting the Declaration and our 4th of July with some water.
I am, although, at the time it was very common. Anytime they'd have public gatherings of patriots, they would often do at least 13 toasts.
Oh my goodness!
States, and sometimes they would go much longer than that. But they would typically toast to George Washington, to independence, to the soldiers, to our French allies, on and on and on.
And what would they toast with? What kind of drink?
I'm guessing probably wine or brandy or port, something like that. I don't know for sure.
I just kind of am picturing all of these founding fathers on the floor by the end of it. That's
they're not quite as sober-minded as we thought.
Exactly. Is that when they created the Constitution? It's just... Yeah. Okay.
So we're talking now about the Declaration.
Exactly.
And of course, it's 1776 is when it's adopted. So next year, we're scheduled to celebrate the semi-quincentennial. Actually, right, 250th. And I've actually been looking forward to this since the bicentennial. I believe I was told people before, but the wife and I actually hope to get married on the bicentennial, and we realized that people were going to fireworks and parties and going to Philadelphia and whatever instead. So we got married the week before, but we did spend had a very nice visit with her parents shortly thereafter in Philadelphia. And this was a year that they had, Ross Perot had bought a copy of the Magna Carta.
Okay.
It was exhibited there in Philadelphia with a lot of the other hoopla that went with the bicentennial. So it's a very important date. American independence, of course, 1776 is a year, but independence had been building for almost a dozen years, pretty much at the end of the French and Indian War, in which we were allied with England against France and Native American allies of theirs. Parliament, partly because they had gone into debt defending the U.S., but also their own interests, and of course it wasn't the U.S. then; it was the 13 colonies.
Right.
The Parliament, which is legally sovereign or all powerful in England, began enacting taxes. And one of the reasons the Magna Carta was so important and was exhibited in 1976 is that it had laid down the principle of no taxation without representation. And since American colonies were not represented in Parliament, and thus those in Parliament would not feel the direct effects of it, the
Mm,
colonists said, this is contrary to principles of the English Constitution. We're still British citizens. That's how they initially considered themselves, with the rights of British citizens. And so they felt that Parliament was being arbitrary. They sent petitions to the king,
mm.
who routinely disregarded or ignored them. But most people think until about the end of 1775, most colonists, their position was that Parliament had wronged them, but they were still holding out that the king would come to their aid.
Mm.
And in January of 1776, a British-born pamphleteer had been brought to the United States in part by Benjamin Franklin, wrote a book called Common
Common
Sense,
sense.
in which he claimed that it was sort of absurd for a continent to be governed by an island, uh, that we didn't. And he basically ridiculed the idea of hereditary succession.
Sure.
Children often are not. Well, sometimes they're smarter than their parents, but sometimes they're
Absolutely.
not.
Though honestly, I don't know how I could ever claim that. I just hope to have a little sliver of the
Well,
brain and the
you have a
brilliance
law
you
degree
have.
and I don't, so that counts for something.
And you have a PhD and I
In
don't.
in either event, we're not gonna worry too much about that. Um, but he made a substantial argument on behalf of American independence that was fairly influential. By the way, he didn't take any royalties for it.
On the
He was
book?
he did not, and it was one of the best sell. I mean, next to the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress, it was the bestseller of his day.
Wow.
Uh, but subsequently, in about May, if I remember, the Continental Congress began to urge states to replace their colonial charters with their own state constitutions. And then in the Second Continental Congress, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. He also introduced a resolution for what became the Articles of Confederation, something to replace British rule, and also for securing foreign allies, which of course eventually ended up being primarily the French. And on what's interesting, so there were debates over this first resolution, and the resolution for independence was actually adopted by the Second Continental Congress on July 2nd of 1776. And there's a fascinating letter by John Adams, who was, along with Mr. Jefferson, was the primary author of the Declaration, but probably the person who had pushed the hardest and served on the most committees for revolution was John Adams of Massachusetts.
Who
And he writes
became
this
our
letter.
second president.
That's right. But he wrote a letter, I believe, to his wife, but whoever, saying, July 2nd is going to be forever celebrated as American independence. We're going to have fireworks and parades and whatever. And as it turns out, apparently, when July 2nd came around the next year, everybody said, "Oh my gosh, we almost forgot the date." The date. And since the document explaining independence was adopted on July 4th, they settled for having the celebration there, and it took.
Hmm.
So that's when we celebrate our Independence Day. And I think really the thing that clinched it happened in 1826. So 50
Interesting.
years to the day after the adoption of the document, Mr. Jefferson breathes his last breath at Monticello, and John Adams breathes his last breath at Montebello. Is it? I'm trying
I don't know.
whatever his home is there in Quincy, just outside Boston. And one of them says, "I remember." Uh, Jefferson says, "Is it the fourth?" And and then he dies, and then John Adams says incorrectly. It turns out Thomas Jefferson still lives.
Oh,
Um, but you can imagine the headlines, at a time, particularly when people often, thought of human events as maybe more providentially ordered than we do today. They saw this sort of as a divine sign. 5 years later, by the way, James Monroe passed away on
mm.
July 4th. 5 years after that, James Madison is getting close to breathing his last, and the doctors come in and say, we could probably give you something to extend your life to the fourth. And he says, don't bother. So, but I'm trying to think. Do you know which president was born on the 4th of July?
Oh, was born and not
Yes,
deceased.
born. Yes.
I do not know which president was
And
born.
one would not necessarily guess it. Calvin Coolidge was
Okay.
born on July 4th. 1876. There was, these are anniversaries. We celebrate them every year, but we tend to focus on the 50s and hundreds.
Right.
So 1876, pretty big, celebration. 1926, of course, 1976, and this I think will be next year. Will probably be the biggest celebration since then.
Yes. And
And
I
of course,
love that it's nice to me, and especially with your background, when you and Mom were married in 1976, that it was the bicentennial, the 200 years after the Declaration was created. So happy anniversary, by the way, for
thank you.
49th anniversary. And
And
then
we're not sure. I think the Pope is waiting to the 50th to canonize my wife,
Mom.
your mother.
Yeah.
Most people think that putting up with me for 50 years probably deserves some kind of sainthood degree, but as yet it is not. It has not yet happened.
Oh, well, the petition is in.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's exciting to me that next year you will have 50 years since the bicentennial.
Yes.
So it's the
Semi-quincentennial.
yes, that
One
year.
half of 500 is basically what it is. And it's a great teaching tool, by the way, if you have youngsters. What is a centennial? What is semi? What is
Quinn.
quin? And you can teach them a fair number of vocabulary words just by the name.
Well, it's exciting, and it's exciting that you will have your 50th wedding anniversary
Yes, it is.
for this
Star
semi-quincentennial.
Spangled anniversary.
Yes. So we're going to try to make sure that Mom actually has some wedding related activities and celebrations rather than just these semi-quincentennial celebrations.
Fair enough.
But that's
Does that mean
exciting.
I have to take her out to eat again?
I think it might be more than that.
Okay.
Just an idea. But I also want to say, along with these other people who really were dedicated to the Declaration and the founding and the Constitution, please let's not plan for you to die on July
okay.
4th of the semi-quincentennial.
Fair enough.
Okay.
I won't plan to do it.
Oh yeah, please let's not plan to. That would be good. And I wanted to go back to something that you discussed with the where this movement was coming in relation to Parliament and this pushback of the taxation without representation. One of the things we currently have still going within our country is the District of Columbia,
That's
who
right.
is fighting back
they're
in the
license
same way.
plates, right?
It is.
Have that term, or is it? I think no
It
taxation
is.
with that representation.
Yes, all of the license plates for DC have the phrase "no taxation without representation." So it's a constant pushback that's shown
It is.
everywhere by the residents of DC who have it on their own license plate, and it is a question. I know, Dr. Vile, that ultimately DC was set up to just be a district so that the seat of government did not have sway. But with all of that, is it time for a change? Is it time to make the District of Columbia an actual state so that
Well,
they do have representation?
we tried to do that by amendment, and it failed. And part of what happened there is that um, you know, the Senate is problematic in that each state has equal representation, and DC would be among the smallest states, maybe the smallest if it were adopted. So I think the more realistic possibility is either to reseed all but the governmental district itself. In other
Mm,
words, all but the White House, the Congress, and the Supreme Court, those kind of buildings, recede them to, I believe it would be Maryland, because I believe most of the area that constituted the district originally that had been given by Virginia has been receded to Virginia.
okay.
But that would be, that would be a possibility. But you'd have to, Maryland would have to be willing to do that, and I don't know that they would want to or not.
I
It's
don't
just
know that it would be a problem with Maryland taking it so much as DC would want to keep its own borders and not be ceded into one of the other states.
well, perhaps.
I think that's the bigger issue. And right now, they don't have a vote in the
Well, they
Senate or
have
Congress.
representation, right? They have it like a shadow representative, but they don't have actual voting representatives in Congress. So yes, that remains an issue.
Yeah.
They're not always consistent. One of the the great inconsistencies, of course, of the American founding is that they're accusing the king of reducing them to absolute slavery
Mm,
when many of them, including Mr. Jefferson, who writes the document, were slaveholders.
right.
And so, what is it? A foolish inconsistency is a hobgoblin of little minds. But in this case,
Amazing. Who wrote that?
Emerson. That's wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Okay.
But in this case, it's a fairly shocking, uh, discrepancy in what people said and how they practiced. And who knows, 250 years from now, what future generations will look back at us and say, "I cannot believe they permitted this to occur."
Right.
So,
And so the other questions, and this is one for me, is always I understand and I know that the Declaration is different than the Constitution.
right,
But
right.
they say, we get mixed up with we the people is, which
And
is that
that's the Constitution, right?
Constitution,
Right.
not
Declaration, when in the course of human events, is how it opens. And the most notable parts of the Declaration are the opening paragraphs. We hold these truths
life.
to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Um, and yeah, it's a document that declares our independence. The Constitution, well, it's initially replaced by the British rule was initially replaced by something known as the Articles of Confederation. But 11 years after the adoption of the Declaration, the U.S. Constitution created a tripartite government with a bicameral Congress and most of the institutions that we know today. I think the most provocative question to be asked as we approach 2026 is whether, so to go back a minute, prior to the Declaration, the colonists had already essentially renounced Parliament. And so when you read the Declaration, it's directed almost completely to the king. So there's a series of like 25, 26 different indictments. It's written very much like a legal brief.
Mm,
Mr. Jefferson was an attorney, so you would expect that. And most of them begin with he has. And their accusations, the king has called together legislatures in untimely places. The king has done this. He's done that. He's waged cruel war against the colonies at the like. And then toward the end, it says he has combined with others.
mm,
They don't even deign to mention Parliament, but that's who they're talking about. And then, of course, the end of the Declaration reminds us that at the time it was considered to be treasonous, at least
right.
by the British. So the delegates mutually pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And some of them do, in fact, lose their lives and their property as a result of their revolutionary activities. So it's a very uh, courageous document in that sense. After the adoption, Benjamin Franklin was alleged to have said, after this, we must hang together or we will hang separately from English nooses.
Interesting. And apologies for the dogs barking. We had a little vacation and we're back home, and they're extremely excited. But what I want to do is also the to me what happened with the declaration, and Dr. Vile, let's make sure we clarify when this was adopted. Two pieces. One, it was not the actual rule of law or the creation of the government. And two, that it really was a coup. It was a full rebellion that went into a coup that says, we don't want you to represent us. We are breaking away completely from England. We are no longer part of your
Right.
state, your
We're a
kingdom.
separate people, basically. We were one people. We were bound together by language, to some degree by religion and culture. But now, now we've come to that stage where we're a different people. And I think where I got sort of sidetracked, I got so excited about talking about the rest of it. But the question that's raised as we approach the semi-quincentennial is, to what degree, having renounced monarchical power, are we back in a situation that is very close to giving a single individual, power through executive orders, and through his own news sources and the like, basically to exercise arbitrary power? And
Right.
I think it's something that we seriously need to consider. Do we still, we talk about three coordinate branches of government, but right now, two-thirds of governmental actions, if not more, seem to be the result of the executive. And frankly, Congress doesn't seem to be doing very much. The courts have not been completely obsequious, but certainly a number of the decisions, some of which we will be discussing,
Right.
seem, again, and most particularly the decision in Trump versus U.S. of last year, in which the court basically limited or expanded presidential immunity
Right.
so that it's almost impossible to prosecute a president for anything that he does while he's in the White
Or
House.
to even stop it while he's there. It's
That's right.
more,
Well, and of course, more than a case that we will soon be discussing is this recent case, Trump versus Casa, in which the court basically says individual, and there's some justification for this, but individual district courts cannot issue nationwide injunctions, even in cases where it appears as though what the president is asking for, in this case, denying citizenship to people born in the United States, even when 99 out of 100 scholars and judges are going to, and three judges who've decided it have all decided that this is unconstitutional.
right. Yeah, it's definitely one of the things to keep in mind and to view, and I like looking at the founders and how they came together, and the Continental Congress that was formed and how they adopted this document. Whereas in our Constitution, which came after the Declaration, there is at least a way that states can form and combine together to adopt amendments to the
Right.
Constitution.
Right.
So, what is that process? Where if the states think Congress isn't doing enough, we're not
Right.
getting what we
Well,
need. Let's get together and do an amendment. How
right.
does
I mean,
that work?
two-thirds of Congress, two-thirds of majorities in both houses of Congress can propose amendments that become ratified by three-quarters of the state legislatures or conventions. Alternatively, two-thirds of the state legislatures can call for a convention, which would propose amendments which would then also have to be ratified by three-quarters of the states. Right now, the good thing and the bad thing about the amending process is it's more difficult than the legislative process, which is in and of itself fairly difficult. And so, particularly at a time like now, where our presidential elections are often decided by, maybe a 1 to 5% margin, and the electoral college sometimes even closer than that, we really don't have the kind of supermajorities that one would need to adopt such an amendment. But it's certainly, certainly worth talking about
Definitely worth talking about.
and writing about.
Exactly, another constitutional convention of
Yes.
the states. I think,
Yes.
I know during your lifetime there hasn't been one.
There
You
hasn't been one since 1787, not a national one. But I do have a book called, I wish I could.
rewriting the American Constitution, I
Well, no,
believe.
I have another one on the process. Actually, University of Georgia published a book on uh, on the Constitutional Convention mechanism.
Amazing. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I don't know if I want to see it in my lifetime, but it is certainly an exciting option.
Now, I seem to be frozen. Are you?
I am not frozen, and you are
My
not
screen is
either.
showing that I'm frozen. If you can see me, I'm not worried about it. But
We certainly can.
okay, well, tell me if you see.
I
You
will.
know,
Don't worry. I'll stay.
there we go.
The pleasures
Okay,
of Zoom, right?
there we go. Yes.
So yeah, we're all familiar with that. But what we want to do then is wish you all a happy 4th of July. Hope this podcast has given you a little bit more information, some interesting facts to remember and to think about
And
during
be
our
careful
country's
with
celebration.
fireworks.
What?
Be careful with fireworks. I almost lost a daughter or two.
Yes, that.
Not on my property, but
No, we definitely had a good go. The one I attended with family members was much less eventful than Rebecca, my sister, who attended another family gathering on the 4th where there was an incident, and many people got thrown into the river to to protect them. So the next year, the shirts that some of the family members made for themselves on the back said, "If you see me running, you better keep up." So yes, please be careful with fireworks and enjoy them properly. Enjoy the time with your family and friends in celebration of our country. And we will be discussing these different cases regarding birthright citizenship, which wasn't quite about birthright citizenship. We're going to be talking upcoming about the Maryland case with the LGBTQ plus reading material in schools. We're going to get to quite a few. There were a lot of cases dropped all at once within this last week. So we will be catching you up on all of those decisions on the next times that we catch you on the Legal Weekly Wine.